I'm so excited to dive into SpongeBob that my younger self is quite literally squeaking around in their leather boots. An unmatched, absolutely legendary television series that has become a common household name for all ages across the globe. After watching all 277 episodes, God help me, I'm happy to say that it's time for me to pass on all that SpongeBob knowledge to you all today, and save you like a week of watching. Without further ado, here we go.
Who lives in a pineapple under the sea?
SpongeBob SquarePants!
If any of you aren't familiar / need a refresher, SpongeBob SquarePants is a show about a yellow sponge named, you guessed it, SpongeBob, who lives in a pineapple under the sea in a town called Bikini Bottom. The show revolves around him and his daily adventures, whether that includes him working hard at the Krusty Krab, fooling around with some of his best friends Patrick or Sandy, or bothering his next-door neighbor Squidward. Speaking of SpongeBob's friends, let's go over the common faces you'll be seeing while I go over some of the most important / iconic SpongeBob episodes yet. Starting off strong is the person closest to SpongeBob, in a literal sense, his pet snail named Gary. Gary is simultaneously a sassy and sweet little guy and is seen pretty regularly throughout the series. He also usually only says one thing. Meow. Patrick Star is SpongeBob's #1 bestie for the restie. He lives 2 houses away from him under a giant rock. And when I say this starfish acts like he's lived under a rock his entire life, I mean it. He's quite dumb, but it's okay because we love him for it anyway. Squidward Tentacles lives directly next to SpongeBob in a giant stone statue-looking building. Almost looks like a tiki head, but at the same time it's kinda off. Anyway, he's rude to SpongeBob, and is incredibly annoyed by everything he does. SpongeBob doesn't understand this though, and thinks that the two of them are also good friends. Not only is Squidward his neighbor, he also works the cash register at the Krusty Krab, which is where the two of them work together, all to serve their boss, Eugene Krabs. Mr. Krabs is, you guessed it, a crab. He's stingy, and overall, crabby. His daughter is a giant white whale named Pearl. Don't ask me who the mother is because nobody knows. Across the street is a rival fast food joint called the Chum Bucket. One of the main storylines that takes place throughout SpongeBob is the owner of the Chum Bucket, Sheldon J. Plankton, and Mr. Krabs' loathing of each other. Also, guys, just call him Plankton. He really doesn't like being called Sheldon. Plankton is the main antagonist of the series, and is constantly trying to steal the Krabby Patty secret formula. Plankton has a wife, which is his computer on wheels. Her name is Karen, and she's almost only ever seen within the Chum Bucket. Sandy is another character commonly seen and is one of SpongeBob's good friends. She's a squirrel who lives in a giant dome underwater in order for her to breathe. Whenever she goes outside over her dome, she is seen wearing a suit that resembles a spaceman outfit. Last, but certainly not least, is Mrs. Puff, SpongeBob's boating license teacher. As you may imagine, SpongeBob is incredibly bad at driving. But hey, it's probably much more difficult to drive boats underwater than it is to drive boats above. Before we dive deep into SpongeBob, I want to remind you all that this is a 277 episode show. I will be going over the entire story of main plot points. Then at the end, I will be going through the entire Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy sequence. Definitely stick around through it all. However, as I will also be creating an epic nostalgia montage of every iconic line and song, I wasn't able to talk about it in depth throughout the show. I hope you all grabbed your jellyfishing nets, and Sit Help Wanted begins with SpongeBob getting his very first job at the Krusty Krab. It begins with him waking up and hyping himself up with some early morning weightlifting. Just look at that, fellas. Look at that form. He then heads over to the titular restaurant itself. Once there, we find that Squidward works there as well, and he's extremely against the idea of SpongeBob working with him. He prompts Mr. Krabs to deny SpongeBob his job request, but Krabs decides to tell him to find a hydrodynamic spatula, which is basically just a fancier spatula with 3 flippers attached to it. Once found and brought back to the shack, he would be guaranteed a job. Mr. Krabs and Squidward both assume that he won't be able to do this, as it's a ridiculous request, and such an item surely does not exist.
A hydro what?
Unfortunately for them, right after SpongeBob leaves for the special spatula, a giant horde of hungry anchovies show up, all of whom are clamoring for their food. Eventually, SpongeBob shows back up with the hydrodynamic spatula and saves the day by making crazy amounts of Krabby Patties almost instantly. The episode ends with Mr. Krabs happily offering SpongeBob the job, as he seems to be an amazing fry cook, and thus the entire series is set into motion. Attaboy, Spongy. This episode begins with SpongeBob and the audience meeting Sandy for the first time. He attempts to rescue her from a giant clam attack, but she ends up saving him instead. The two start bonding, and SpongeBob asks about her air helmet, to which she tells him that she loves air and that it's very important to her. SpongeBob lies, saying that he loves air too, since he's too awkward to tell her that he has no idea what air is.
I guess so.
That's just fancy talk.
Who knew a talking sponge could be so relatable? She invites him over to her tree dome for tea and lots of air, to which he agrees, even though he still doesn't know what air is. Once at the tree dome, SpongeBob quickly begins to dehydrate, but he doesn't really know what's going on or how to fix his problem.
Do some flowers!
For me? How sweet.
He tries his best to fit in, but eventually makes a bolt for the door as he can't handle any more of the air. Patrick blocks his path, however, telling him he's gotta stay in order to make a good impression on Sandy. Unfortunately for him, once inside the tree dome, Patrick instantly starts to dry out as well, and is seen shriveling up next to SpongeBob. The two desperately claw at the door, attempting to make their escape when all of a sudden, Sandy shows back up and witnesses catastrophe that is occurring right before her eyes. She gets the two water helmets that contrast her own Scene Air helmet, and they all have tea together. The episode ends with her telling the boys that if they needed water, they should have just told her so in the first place. The episode Ripped Pants is the first appearance of Larry the Lobster, a very buff beachgoer at Goo Lagoon. Also, the episode has the Ripped Pants song. Legendary one piece of media right there.
Ripped his pants. I know I shouldn't mope around, I shouldn't.
In the episode Jellyfishing, an inside glimpse at how much, well, jellyfishing means to SpongeBob and Patrick begins with incredible misfortune for Squidward. It all begins when Squidward denies the two when they ask him to go jellyfishing with them. He goes bicycling instead, but ends up getting in crazy bad wreck, ironically due to a jellyfish accident. Now in a full-body cast, SpongeBob and Patrick decide to make Squidward have the best day ever, which consists of nothing he enjoys. Of course they don't know this. They're just trying to help a buddy out, you know? Towards the end of the day, they decide to take Squiddy jellyfishing, to which he gets frustrated and ends up smacking a jellyfish with his net purposefully. The jellyfish then grows exponentially in size, and then promptly chases and zaps Squidward. The next day, he is seen on goddamn life support and unresponsive. Do not get stung by jellyfish, folks. Moving along, SpongeBob and Patrick visit him at home and gift him a jellyfish they caught. Squidward, who's incredibly upset with the two boys, releases the jellyfish, and it chases and zaps the two. But no bad deed goes unpunished, as the episode ends with a massive queen jellyfish arriving yet again to antagonize Squidward and completely roast him. Literally. The episode Plankton begins with Mr. Krabs, who after thwarting another patty thieving scheme has to introduce SpongeBob to none other than his arch nemesis, Plankton. The titles in this season are straight and to the point. He explains that Plankton is a competitor who's been trying to steal the secret Krabby Patty formula for ages. He then flings him back over to where he belongs, the Chum Bucket, which is both the place the green guy resides and is also his own business that never gets any, well, business. Later that night, Plankton sneaks around to SpongeBob and claims the two of them are good friends. SpongeBob, being a nice guy at heart, is skeptical but tries to stay cordial. When Plankton invites SpongeBob to his birthday party, he claims that SpongeBob must bring him a gift, to which SpongeBob assumes he needs a booster seat.
A booster seat?
Booster seat, hot dog. I mean, no.
I didn't know SpongeBob was savage like that. Plankton obviously gets annoyed by this and exclaims that he obviously wants a Krabby Patty as his present. SpongeBob angrily refuses, as he still remembers what happened earlier that day. And because of this, Plankton has no choice but to sneak into SpongeBob's house while he's sleeping and attach a controller to his brain. This was the only option, I promise.
Sit, brain, you're going down.
He forces SpongeBob to steal a Krabby Patty and brings it into the Chum Bucket for further examination. Once there, SpongeBob starts describing the patty in great detail, causing Plankton to get so hungry that he jumps out of SpongeBob's brain in hopes to bite the savory sandwich. Unfortunately for him, he falls into his own machine and SpongeBob successfully makes it out of the situation unscathed, with Patty in hand. The episode Boating School begins with SpongeBob heading over to boating school. Big shocker. To which the audience quickly finds out this ain't his first time trying to get his license. He answers all the oral questions incredibly quickly, but the moment he gets in the boat, he wrecks it, causing Mrs. Puff to puff. The next day, he goes and tries again, but this time with help from Patrick. who tells him what to do whenever he starts panicking. This works out decently at first, but after the test, Mrs. Puff jokes about how if he were to have someone whispering how to do everything in his ear, then that would have been considered cheating. SpongeBob freaks out upon learning this and starts driving crazy all around the course. Mrs. Puff begs him to stop, but it's just not enough to quell SpongeBob's panic as he ends up causing yet another car crash. He, of course, still does not obtain his license, and the episode ends with him riding around on his unicycle. An unfortunate day for SpongeBob Home Sweet Pineapples begins with hungry nematodes absolutely destroying SpongeBob's peaceful pineapple abode. Just look at those suckers, literally. Startled, SpongeBob awakens to an increasingly shrinking pineapple and decides to call Squidward for help, for some reason. Why SpongeBob relies on that man, or should I say Squid, for anything at all is beyond me. Before he can explain what's happening, his shell phone, along with everything else in the house, shrinks and ceases to exist. Distraught, SpongeBob assumes he will be needing to move in with his parents, but with Patrick's convincing, he attempts to rebuild his pineapple first, which works. But unfortunately, they only have small pineapples to work with. SpongeBob then attempts to stay with Patrick after he begged for SpongeBob not to leave for his parents. But this plan proves futile once they have a tug-of-war battle regarding who gets more rock to use as a blanket. Fed up, SpongeBob just decides to call up his parents to come pick him up in order to save him from his unfortunate situation. That morning, we see SpongeBob's parents for the first time. Aren't they just beautiful? Fine specimens of sponge.
Come on, SpongeBob. Hurry, hurry, son. Your mother has dinner waiting.
Before taking off, SpongeBob sadly plants the pebble that was left behind from his house and cries as he says goodbye. The second his tear rolls off his face and onto the pebble, another massive pineapple house grows and plops down right where his last one left off. The episode ends with SpongeBob being excited that he'll be living there forever, just like he'd originally planned, and Squidward wanting to die as he was excited to finally catch a break. Bubble Bass, an icon and a fiend, takes center stage in Pickles, where he waddles into the Krusty Krab. He publicly humiliates SpongeBob in front of every fish inside of the Krusty Krab after claiming that SpongeBob didn't put pickles on his sandwich, and clearly doesn't remember how to make Krabby Patties anymore.
Pickles, 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 pickles.
Scared and distraught, SpongeBob is sent home and reassesses his mistake, while having somewhat of a mental breakdown in the process. Mr. Krabs later arrives at his pineapple to try and get him back at the Krusty Krab after Squidward proved to be a horrible chef. SpongeBob, now confident in his abilities after his break, eventually arrives back at the Krusty Krab to serve Bubble Bass yet again. At first, Bubble Bass accuses SpongeBob yet again of being an incompetent fry cook. But SpongeBob notices something off about the way that he's speaking and calls him out on, gasp, hiding pickles underneath his tongue. The episode ends with Bubble Bass running away in humiliation and everyone cheering on SpongeBob for being back in the kitchen, and booing Squidward for even trying.
Oh, you stink!
Now we're looking at The Chaperone. And okay, so fun fact about this episode before I begin, SpongeBob appears to have a sponge dummy that he uses in uncomfortable situations that he doesn't want to be in. It's first seen in the beginning of the episode, and at the very end of the episode, SpongeBob comes into the scene and takes him away, leading me to believe that almost this entire episode was actually just the dummy pretending to be SpongeBob in order to avoid the awkward responsibility of being the chaperone. To this day, the episode still confuses me. Anyway, let's dive in. It begins with Pearl profusely crying to Mr. Krabs about how she no longer has a date to the prom. Mr. Krabs, not having literally any other options, offers SpongeBob as her date. Pearl is obviously upset about this, but agrees anyway, as she's got no other choice. SpongeBob is then seen getting ready, and let me just say, this man looks quite spiffy.
What do you think, Pearl?
I mean, just look at him go. Anyway, right from the start of the prom night, it's an absolute train wreck. The two eventually start to have fun together and start dancing, and their electric dance moves even encourage others to dance as well. But they end up dancing so aggressively that everyone starts getting injured and trashing the place. The two are then lifted up and thrown out of the oh-so-coveted high school gymnasium. Back at home, Pearl tells SpongeBob that while the whole night was a flop, she still had a bunch of fun with him, and doesn't regret a thing. After she goes inside, the whole dummy thing happens. The real SpongeBob approaches the dressed up one and claims that his dummy sure does come in handy sometimes. Creepy, and slightly confusing. I Was a Teenage Gary begins with SpongeBob asking Squidward to take care of Gary, since he had to go out of town for a jellyfishing competition with Patrick. Squidward quickly agrees and shoos him out of the house. It's only until SpongeBob is on his way back that Squidward realizes he forgot to check on Gary even a singular time. He rushes over to SpongeBob's house to find Gary extremely ill, looking as dry as a damn mummy. Once back home, SpongeBob calls the vet, who gives him a snail syringe, informing him that they must inject Gary with it. SpongeBob doesn't want to do this, however, because he's squirmish, so he has Squidward do it instead. Unfortunately, SpongeBob can't stop moving Gary, as he's worried the syringe will hurt him, and Squidward accidentally injects SpongeBob instead, who instantly flips out in fear. Meanwhile, Gary drinks some water and ends up being perfectly fine.
Oh, Gary, you're better.
Later that night, SpongeBob literally turns into a snail. Yeah, no kidding. That's what the syringe did. Note to self, don't take snail medicine. He goes over to Squidward's for help, but Squidward is so freaked out by him that he runs away instead of assisting him. While running, he accidentally also injects himself, and eventually turns into a snail as well. The end of the episode consists of the three of them singing a snail song together.
Will you clam up?
This episode, in my opinion, is one of the most iconic episodes to date. SB129 begins with Squidward accidentally trapping himself in the freezer of the Krusty Krab while attempting to hide from SpongeBob, as he doesn't want to go jellyfishing with him and Patrick. He assumes someone will eventually find him, but is then shown as an ice block 2,000 years in the future. Once freed from his chilly prison, he demands to go back to his original time frame, to which a SpongeBob-ish robot leads him to a time machine. Instead of going back to his normal time, however, he decides to try to go to a time that doesn't involve SpongeBob. All he really wants to do is play his clarinet in peace.
I can finally be alone with my clarinet.
Once, in primitive times, he's unfortunately bombarded with prehistoric SpongeBob and Patrick and barely make it out alive. Once back in the time machine, he enters a place that appears to be before time existed. The empty space repetitively tells Squidward that he's all alone. He eventually begins going insane, reasonably so, and makes it back to the time machine once more. The episode ends with Squidward back in his own time, left to deal with SpongeBob forever. Also, Squidward accidentally invented jellyfishing thanks to time travel shenanigans. Good on him. Hope he's got a prehistoric patent or something. Another iconic masterpiece, Rock Bottom, begins with SpongeBob and Patrick taking the wrong bus home from their favorite amusement park, Glove World. They accidentally take the bus to Rock Bottom, which seemingly is just a deeper part of the ocean. Is anyone a fan of trenches? While SpongeBob was trying to figure out the next bus they needed to get on in order to get home, Patrick accidentally leaves his friend behind after getting on the bus back home. Now, alone and afraid, SpongeBob struggles with attempting to find another bus to ride, when all of a sudden, the conductor tells him that they're actually closed now, and there won't be another bus until the next morning. He then proceeds to turn off all the lights in the area, and SpongeBob is left in complete darkness. He tries to hype himself up, but nothing seems to be working. Poor guy. All of a sudden, he starts hearing a strange noise, causing him to panic over this unknown stranger with unknown aspirations, growing closer and closer, all in the shadows. He gets less scared when he realizes it's just a kind-looking angler who's trying to give back his balloon that he'd obviously lost that he got from Glove World. SpongeBob is thankful, but confused as the anglerfish won't stop blowing into his balloon, until he opens his eyes and realizes that the anglerfish was blowing it up enough for him to float back to Bikini Bottom. The episode ends with us seeing Patrick on an early morning bus ride back to Rock Bottom in his attempts to save SpongeBob from the darkness. He may be stupid, but at least he's a good friend. Ooh, here's another goodie, Bossy Boots. This episode begins with Mr. Krabs letting SpongeBob and Squidward know that he'll be hiring Pearl to work with them during her summer vacation. He also warns them that she may have some new hip ideas that should be bringing in more business. Squidward is extremely upset about this and tells SpongeBob that they will be needing to stand up for themselves if they're wanting to keep their same jobs and lifestyles. SpongeBob initially agreed until he actually likes a lot of the changes that Pearl has proposed. Squidward quickly quits after some regulars show up and wouldn't eat there anymore, leaving just Pearl and SpongeBob. Suddenly, SpongeBob's worst nightmare arises when he goes back into his kitchen and his stove is gone, and he's told not to make Krabby Patties anymore, just salad, which he's never even heard of before. He goes into Mr. Krabs' office to complain about all that has gone wrong, and he profusely agrees with SpongeBob and asks him to fire Pearl as he can't bring himself to do it. SpongeBob eventually is able to do just that, and we find that Pearl actually really didn't want to work there anyway. And thanks SpongeBob for letting her go. The episode ends with Pearl riding off to the mall with her friends and SpongeBob being able to take all the hip decorations home with him to redecorate his house. I don't know why, but this episode reminds me of my little sister, the way that SpongeBob creates his own little bubble buddy. This iconic episode begins with SpongeBob realizing that all of his friends are busy for the day, so he creates his own buddy by blowing up a human-like bubble.
Bubble Buddy!
He then takes Bubble Buddy to do many different activities with him, such as eating at the Krusty Krab and catching sun at Goo Lagoon. Unfortunately for Bubble Buddy, nobody in town likes him, and they all become increasingly frustrated with him to the point where they try and pop him. Since when do we start murdering people when they cause minor frustration? Before Squidward can deal the final popping blow, Bubble Buddy comes to life and catches the needle, proclaims that things are getting a little weird around here, hops in a bubble taxi, and heads out of Bikini Bottom. The episode ends with a distraught Squidward trying to come to terms with Bubbles being alive. In the episode Grandma's Kisses, unsurprisingly, we find that SpongeBob is in fact a Grammy boy. He shows up to work with a kiss mark on his forehead after an afternoon spent with his grandmother, and everybody there makes fun of him.
Plays with dolls.
He then decides that he needs to act more like an adult, and can't come to work like that ever again. The next time he goes to visit his grandmother, he claims that he's too old for kisses, and that he's an adult and needs to act like one. Kinda cold, honestly. She doesn't complain about this, but she also doesn't offer him any cookies, or tuck him in for nap time, and seems unfazed when he tells her he may not be able to visit as often. SpongeBob then has a mental breakdown and starts crying everywhere. I'll let the irony of that one speak for itself. His grandmother calms him down and tells him that even though he's an adult, he can still get love from his grandmother and have a soft spot. That's genuinely good advice right there. This makes him feel much better, and he goes about his day hoping she won't tell anybody from the Krusty Krab about what just happened. The episode ends with us finding out that everybody from the Krusty Krab were watching the events unfold from his grandmother's window. What a bunch of stalkers. In Squidville, after being fed up by SpongeBob and Patrick yet again, Squidward decides to move to Tentacle Acres, where he quickly realizes that everybody there looks and acts exactly like him. Many of his favorite hobbies are offered in town, including dance lessons, clarinet playing in the park, and bicycling around town. Not to mention how excited Squidward got about canned bread that he found at their local store.
Canned bread! This town is great!
Yep, just look at that face of pure joy. Anyway, everything is going swimmingly until Squidward realizes that every single day is a loop, and literally nothing ever changes. He ends up going slightly insane and playing with a leaf blower, and well, this ends up causing mass chaos as literally none of the other squids want him to be doing that. The episode ends with SpongeBob and Patrick showing up to the neighborhood in search of Squidward, but because everybody looks the same, they're confused as to which one he is. Although they're certain that it isn't the squid currently flying in the air from his leaf blower. That squid is much too raucous and happy. Time to look at Christmas Who. This festive episode begins with Sandy telling SpongeBob all about what Christmas is about, after he's confused about the lights she puts up in her tree dome. After telling him about Christmas, SpongeBob decides to spread festive cheer throughout Bikini Bottom and tells everybody what he knows. They all write letters to Santa and put them in glass bottles in order for them to float to the surface, with the only person refusing to participate being Squidward,
Thunderhead's mouth!
who just shuts his blinds during everybody's singing and decorating. The next day, they all await Santa, except for Squidward, who never wrote him a note. They sing all night, but Santa never comes, which sends SpongeBob spiraling into depression. In reality, the reason he didn't come was because you have to be asleep for him to actually be able to show up. Squidward laughs at a sad SpongeBob and even takes a photo to commemorate the occasion. SpongeBob sadly gives Squidward a present he made for him, and it ends up being a hand-carved wooden clarinet. Squidward, who finally realizes how rude he is actually being, begins to feel bad for the sponge and decides to dress up like Santa in order to make him feel better. It works, but maybe too well. Every single person in Bikini Bottom shows up to Squidward's house, expecting him to magically have presents for all of them. Squidward ends up giving almost all of his possessions away in hopes for people to believe his lie, in a rare change of heart from the grumpy cephalopod. The episode ends with him seeing the real Santa actually flying above him after everybody leaves, with a note on his doorstep thanking him for everything. Oh, also, Patchy and Potty are in this episode. You know Patchy, president of the SpongeBob SquarePants fan club, and Potty, his bird. If you didn't know, now you do. The episode I'm Your Biggest Fanatic begins with SpongeBob and Patrick attending a jellyfishing convention. Here, SpongeBob meets his biggest idol, Kevin, a sea cucumber who's the leader of the Jelly Spotters, which is basically just a club for people who like to catch jellyfish. SpongeBob fawns over Kevin, which the cucumber rudely uses to his advantage. he wants to embarrass SpongeBob, but is unable to do so as everything he tells SpongeBob to do backfires on him and results in him getting stung by jellyfish over and over again. Kevin eventually gets fed up and asks a more difficult task, which is for SpongeBob to catch a queen jellyfish. After a long day of searching, he comes up empty-handed until a large jellyfish with a crown approaches, seemingly the queen. SpongeBob is at first excited until he realizes that it's actually just a giant jellyfish robot driven by Kevin and other jelly spotters.
Highness, I would have let you go.
He chases SpongeBob and threatens him with zaps until a gigantic king jellyfish shows up, who misunderstands the queen jellyfish as a real jellyfish and falls in love with it. Kevin and the jelly spotters are horrified until SpongeBob blows a giant pie bubble in order to distract the king. He takes the jelly pie and swims away, leaving SpongeBob to be the savior of the day. All of the jelly spotters are upset with Kevin for continuously trying to ruin SpongeBob, and so they dethrone them as their leader, offering the torn-off tip of Kevin's head to SpongeBob. It's less horrifying than it sounds. While grateful, he denies the offer, since he cares more about jellyfishing than their little clan they're a part of. Also, Jeffrey Jellyfish. The episode Welcome to the Chum Bucket begins with Mr. Krabs betting off SpongeBob's work contract to Plankton in a game of cards. He tells SpongeBob that he's been playing cards with Plankton for 15 years, and he's never lost a game, prompting him to believe he will literally never lose.
I never lose!
Unfortunately for him, and even more unfortunate for SpongeBob, Krabs does lose, and so now Spongy must start working for Plankton. Once there, Plankton demands that he make him a Krabby Patty, but SpongeBob refuses, claiming that the atmosphere just isn't right for him. Plankton is at first furious with this, until Karen calms him down and explains that all he has to do is accommodate for what the SpongeBob is wanting in order to build trust. Plankton eventually completely transforms the entire interior of the Chum Bucket to mimic the inside of the Krusty Krab, all to make SpongeBob feel more comfortable. SpongeBob becomes aware of the power he has over Plankton and decides to be extremely difficult until he gets sick enough of him to return him to Mr. Krabs. His plan eventually works, and the episode ends with Plankton desperately returning him, even offering up money on top of his return, even though he did have to have his brain planted in a robot to get to that point. Yikes. A clever play on Frankenstein, Frankendoodle is all about SpongeBob being haunted by his own confusing creation. It all begins when a French artist drops his pencil in the ocean for SpongeBob and Patrick to find. The duo quickly realize that whatever they draw happens to come to life. Wanting to confuse Squidward, SpongeBob draws himself and names it Doodlebob, but unknowingly causes chaos within Bikini Bottom, as Doodlebob is actually quite evil and causes chaos throughout Bikini Bottom. SpongeBob decides to erase him, since he's being a weirdo, but unfortunately doesn't realize that he didn't quite get to Doodlebob's hand. That night, he redraws himself and battles SpongeBob. During battle, he steps on a piece of paper and gets attached. Revealing his weakness, SpongeBob quickly traps him into a book and frames his page in his house. The episode ends with us finally seeing Doodlebob happy and content. As a former band geek myself, this episode hits a little too close to home. It all begins when Squidward gets a call from his high school nemesis, Squilliam, who invites Squidward to play at the Bubble Bowl. Since his own band is unable to attend, Squidward accepts, insisting that he does have a band in order to one-up and/or impress Squilliam. He then gets his friends together and forces them to try and learn instruments, but this seems futile. The day of the performance, however, his friends decide to show up and show out, since at the end of the day, they do love and care for Squidward and his success. They ended up absolutely demolishing their performance and were the hit of the night. I don't know about Squilliam, but if I were to have been him, I would have been inking in my trousers. Let's look at I'm With Stupid, a family reunion episode. It begins with Patrick explaining to SpongeBob that his parents will be arriving soon, and he's extremely worried about them thinking he's stupid, as he doesn't like when they constantly condescend him. SpongeBob offers to act super stupid in order for Patrick to look smart by comparison, and Patrick happily agrees. Unfortunately for SpongeBob, Patrick begins saying rude and unnecessary things about him, as if he's actually stupid. It gets to the point where SpongeBob is fed up with it and asks Patrick to stop. Except Patrick is so dumb he forgot the plan that they agreed upon and was actually convinced that SpongeBob was stupid.
I'm only pretending to be dumb. It was our plan, remember?
This upsets SpongeBob to the point of him having to confront Patrick's parents himself. except they still don't believe that he's actually smart, leaving him to get so upset that he runs away and isn't seen in the rest of the episode. It concludes with Patrick's real parents showing up, meaning the starfish that were in his house the entire time literally weren't even his parents, and they all laugh together about the silly little incident. Season 3's Club SpongeBob starts with SpongeBob and Patrick having their semi-cultish club meeting in their little treehouse. Squidward, who is annoyed because the two said that he wouldn't fit in their club, climbs up their treehouse, since he's part of several different elite clubs throughout Bikini Bottom, and he will surely be a part of their stupid secret one as well. It's only until after he climbs up into their tree that he realizes the reason they said he wouldn't fit in is because there is literally no room in the treehouse. Squidward tries to escape by pulling on a different branch to force himself out of the treehouse, but ends up launching them deep into a kelp forest instead. Squidward, not knowing what to do, starts panicking. But instead of following suit, SpongeBob takes out his magic conch, which he and Patrick seem to trust with their lives. He begins asking it what to do, and it tells them to do nothing. SpongeBob and Patrick proceed to sit in silence for several days until a bunch of food randomly drops from the sky after a cargo malfunction. Squidward, who didn't believe in the conch at all, is dumbfounded by their luck. But upon asking the conch if he can have any food, he only gets no as an answer. Eventually, a park ranger shows up to find them, and Squidward is relieved to be around someone who's normal, until he too pulls out a conch shell. At this point in the episode, it becomes clear that those who worship the conch are in some sort of weird cult. At least if you're me, that's what I believe. Because who would believe in that? The park ranger asks the conch what to do now that he found the lost civilians, and it tells him nothing. The ranger, SpongeBob, and Patrick end up sitting in silence yet again. A tired Squidward who gave up and now also worships said conch closes out the episode. This one is another fan favorite, chocolate with nuts. It begins with SpongeBob and Patrick receiving one of Squidward's magazines in the mail on accident, which highlighted fancy living lifestyles and wealthy fish. The two ask Squidward how they got like that, to which he replies they're entrepreneurs and sell things. This gives the two the bright idea to start selling their own product in hopes to become rich and fancy like those from the magazine. They're extremely unsuccessful and get scammed multiple times by the same fish. Not to mention the entire episode they're being chased by a fish named Tom who keeps screaming, "Chocolate!
Chocolate! Chocolate!
At them. Eventually, Tom catches up to them, and after the boys have lost basically all of their money and have no hope throughout the city, he offers to pay for all their chocolate, as he is a chocolate fanatic. SpongeBob and Patrick happily sell him the rest of their chocolate. But then they waste their money going to a fancy restaurant on a double date with two people they had tried to scam previously in the episode. The camping episode begins with Squidward being annoyed yet again with SpongeBob and Patrick, this time for setting up a camping site right in front of SpongeBob's house. He eventually joins the two after he mistakenly thinks they're making fun of him for not joining in on the fun. Squidward tries, and fails, to show them how to properly camp, and eventually starts playing his clarinet after being annoyed with their campfire songs. To which SpongeBob quickly shuts him up by shooting a marshmallow into the bell of his clarinet. He explains to Squidward that the sound of playing the clarinet badly at night attracts sea bears. Squidward is unamused and claims that sea bears don't actually exist, and then proceeds to do every single thing that SpongeBob tells him attracts the vicious creatures. SpongeBob draws an anti-sea bear circle around him and Patrick, and urges Squidward to join them, but he won't. Wouldn't you believe it? Eventually, a real sea bear does actually show up and mauls the crap out of Squidward until he has the decency to jump into the circle with SpongeBob and Patrick. The episode ends with Patrick and SpongeBob saying, well, at least it wasn't a sea rhinoceros, to which Squidward asks what attracts those, and Patrick responds with the sound of a sea bear attack. Squidward then sighs in defeat as he knows what's about to happen to him. Season 4 begins with Shell of a Man, in which Mr. Krabs gets excited about his Navy reunion until he molts and becomes a shell of a man. Get it? Anyway, SpongeBob can hear him crying in his office, and when he goes to investigate, he sees a basically naked Mr. Krabs. He explains to SpongeBob that when he gets too big for his shell, he outgrows it. He doesn't know what to do for his reunion, since he's known for his tough shell, until SpongeBob accidentally flies into it when he gets a brilliant idea. He
I'm you!
SpongeBob, you're a genius!
Well, I'm
asks SpongeBob if he will pretend to be him during his reunion, to which he happily agrees, and everything goes smoothly, until SpongeBob accidentally starts talking about jellyfishing during his speech. Then he flies around the room after being punched in the stomach by one of Mr. Krabs' Navy buddies who wanted to see just how tough he was. The shell cracks, and SpongeBob comes flying out of it. Mr. Krabs emerges and confesses to the boys that he outgrew his shell and is no longer tough at the moment. In response, they all praise him as the manliest thing he could have done was confess and share his real feelings. The rest of the Navy buddies confess their own unmanly faults that they have now, mostly due to their age, all to show the crustacean that he isn't alone. The episode ends with Mr. Krabs laughing because his shell will grow back, but most of the things they confess to will never be fixed.
I messed up, and now you're gone.
The two-parter episode, Have You Seen This Snail?, begins with SpongeBob receiving a new paddleboard game in the mail, where he has to get a certain number in a row in order to win. He does this for so long he forgets to feed Gary his dinner that night, and even yells at Gary whenever he asks SpongeBob multiple times for food. Fed up with his owner, Gary decides to leave the house and run away since he isn't being taken care of. Later that week, Patrick shows up to SpongeBob's house. The arrival of a new person seems to break SpongeBob from his trance, and he realizes that he never fed Gary dinner, only to find out from Patrick that it's actually been a whole week since the game arrived.
Full challenge?
About a week.
A week? Are you sure?
Well,
SpongeBob realizes that Gary must have run away, and sadly leaves to go throughout town in hopes to find him. Meanwhile, Gary finds an old lady that takes him in and feeds him a lot. SpongeBob and Patrick put up signs all around town searching for him, but can't find him anywhere. Gary eventually finds a bunch of old snail shells cracked and dusted over in the old woman's house, and he realizes that she is fattening him up on purpose in order to eat him. Maybe. Or maybe she just inadvertently overfeeds the snails to death. Regardless, he quickly runs away and finds SpongeBob again, happy to be back with his original, safe owner. The episode ends with SpongeBob apologizing to Gary and promising that the two will have a much better relationship from now on. Time to look at Enemy-in-Law. This strange episode begins with Plankton noticing Betsy, Mr. Krabs' mother, and falling in love instantly. Karen, obviously upset about this, begins arguing with Plankton, but he just turns her off to make her stop talking. God damn, this man really is a villain. He then proceeds to go after Betsy, and the two start dating much to Mr. Krabs' dismay. The real reason why he's upset though is because his mother does in fact know the Krabby Patty formula, as it's an old family recipe. Upon discovering this, Plankton attempts to ask Betsy to marry him. She refuses, as she isn't ready to make such a commitment right now. And not long after Plankton finds out that she was cheating on him with a robot? I don't know, man, I'm confused too. Plankton still asks her for the Krabby Patty formula in order to repay him for cheating, and she ends up smacking him all the way back to the chum bucket. The episode ends with him accidentally turning Karen's switch back on and her reprimanding him until the credits roll. In the episode Chimps Ahoy, we meet Sandy's bosses. They're these three chimps that she's extremely worried about meeting, as apparently if they don't like anything she's invented while being in Bikini Bottom, they will revoke her right to stay there and remove her funding, forcing her to move back home to Texas. She's so overwhelmed by this that she's unable to do anything at all. Relatable. SpongeBob and Patrick decide to help her out and create their own invention that does 4 different things in one, though I gotta say, it looks monstrous. Once the chimps arrive, the device works but malfunctions and ends up harming the chimps. They're extremely frustrated, until Sandy's nutcracker invention peels their bananas for them. They're extremely excited by this and have been searching for such an invention for many years. Yeah, that's fair, I guess. They promote Sandy to a higher salary and guarantee her another 20 years in her tree dome because of her wonderful invention. In the episode New Leaf, Plankton allegedly decides to retire. It begins with him waving a white handkerchief towards the Krusty Krab, which is normally an act of surrender. Mr. Krabs doesn't believe him, however, and is extremely rude to him. Once he somewhat believes him, he apologizes and offers him a night out at the carnival. The two actually have fun together, and Mr. Krabs offers him the secret Krabby Patty formula to make it up for him for real. Plankton accepts, but only after refusing a couple times first. The episode ends with him in the chum bucket laughing evilly, thinking that his master plan ended up working, until he opens the note to find that it reads, "Gotcha. Heart, Mr. Krabs." Plankton then screams in agony until the credits roll. I mean, yeah, he deserved it. That was rude. Time to look at Friend or Foe. The story of the Krabby Patty formula and Plankton and Krabs' history has kind of been muddled over the years, but this is generally seen as the genuine article when it comes to Krabby Patty lore. Even still though, this story has a lot of question marks. The The origin of Mr. Krabs and Plankton's feud is told in several different versions, from each of the two perspectives. Mr. Krabs' version is that they've been best friends since birth. The two of them were both bullied by everybody around them and decided to create a burger joint in order to make everybody like them. Once the two were somewhat successful, Plankton made a weird comment about how soon they will be controlling their customers' hearts and minds in order to rule Bikini Bottom. This resulted in them having a squabble and the secret recipe being ripped in half, leaving Plankton with only the "a pinch of chum" part, resulting in him creating his entire franchise off of chum. Plankton argues with Mr. Krabs and claims that the whole story was correct, except it was Mr. Krabs who started being weird and controlling over people's money. Karen then steps in and says she knows the real story. Apparently, when the two created their burger, it was so bad it caused a fish to faint. The two began arguing with each other, like they'd both claimed, and during this scuffle, they bumped into the shelf with multiple different ingredients on it. It is dumped into their original mixture and creates the new Krabby Patty secret formula. Plankton leaves with the bottom half of their original recipe, and Mr. Krabs is left with the formula that will soon make him rich for the rest of his life. The episode ends with Mr. Krabs attempting to apologize to Plankton, but SpongeBob notices that during his apology, Plankton attempts to steal the formula out of Mr. Krabs' pocket, leaving the two to chase each other around as per usual. On the topic of Krabby lore, here's the episode The Original Fry Cook. It begins with Jim, the original fry cook himself, showing back up to the Krusty Krab. Squidward reminisces on when the Krusty Krab had class, since when Jim worked there, the whole place was slightly fancier. SpongeBob instantly feels inferior to Jim, as Jim's Krabby Patties taste much better than his. Jim explains to SpongeBob that the reason he left was because he wanted a raise from Mr. Krabs, and he wouldn't give it to him. He decides to leave and do bigger and better things, which ultimately bettered him as a fry cook, and let him be as good as he is today. He urges SpongeBob to quit as well, considering he could probably become better as well. But SpongeBob loves the place too much to ever do so. The episode ends with Jim leaving and calling the Krusty Krab a dump, to which Mr. Krabs agrees, but it's his dump, and that's all that matters. You know what? At least he owns up to it. Now we're looking at
Atlantis SquarePants.
This 40-minute-long special episode begins with SpongeBob and Patrick finding a mysterious piece of gold deep in a cave during their bubble-blowing shenanigans. And so, they decide to take it to Bikini Bottom's museum in order to find out what it is. Squidward notices the boys and thinks they're stealing from the museum and takes their gold to put it back, only to realize that they actually found the missing piece to a fractured amulet already displayed in the museum. When the two pieces are put together, a magical bus arrives and explains that they are there to take them to Atlantis. Coincidentally, Sandy and Mr. Krabs were also in the area of the museum upon the bus arriving, so they all decide to go together. Unfortunately, little do they know that Plankton is also stowing away on the bus in hopes to use Atlantis' advanced weapon technology in order to steal the Krabby Patty secret formula. Once in Atlantis, they meet the king, voiced by David Bowie, might I add, and are shown around the town. There is a special room for everybody, a treasure room for Mr. Krabs, an art exhibit for Squidward, and a laboratory for Sandy.
Okay, I've seen enough. Let me out of this thing!
All of whom get their own songs because this is a musical episode. You know who doesn't get a song? David Bowie. How? Why? Okay, sorry, had to vent. Anyway, when it comes to SpongeBob and Patrick's room, they're shown the world's oldest bubble. Patrick instantly takes a photo of it and it pops due to the flash. The two freak out and attempt to leave during dinner, to which the king wonders what's going on. Patrick ends up confessing and the king laughs it off, as the bubble he showed them is actually a fake that they showed tourists. He then pulls out the real bubble, to which Patrick, like an idiot, takes a photo of it. It pops, and the king, enraged, sends his guards to send them all away. During their fight to be freed from Atlantis, Plankton shows up threatening them with all the weapons that he found. After his long speech about him taking over Bikini Bottom, he triggers the weapon only to find that it only shoots out strawberry ice cream. The king is infatuated by Plankton's small body and puts him in a jar much like the one used to contain the oldest bubble. He claims that Plankton will be a wonderful addition to their collection in the museum to replace the bubble. He then sends the rest of the tourists all away on the bus back to Bikini Bottom. SpongeBob is happy about this, because of course he is, and sings the whole way home, while his friends cry, sad because of their loss of fun rooms catered directly to them. The episode Blackjack begins with SpongeBob receiving news that his cousin Blackjack has recently gotten out of jail. He strangely has written to SpongeBob threatening him with physical violence and also mentioning his parents. He quickly travels to his parents' home, but it's covered in tape and cut off from the public. He then goes to his grandmother's house since he's worried about familial violence. And once there, he learned that he also called his grandmother, talking about how he has unfinished business with SpongeBob. This frightens him even more. and he decides to travel to his uncle's house, who's a retired police officer. He tells SpongeBob to stop being a baby about it and stay out of it, as that line of work isn't for him. SpongeBob then goes to his cousin's house to figure out what's what. He enters the house and runs to the basement after hearing his mother scream. When he enters the room, he realizes that his parents are in no danger and are simply throwing a release party for his cousin. His cousin then charges at SpongeBob, but he finds that he's no bigger than a small cookie crumb and can literally do no damage whatsoever. Huh. What a twist. This 20-minute special episode begins with every single one of SpongeBob's friends being incredibly mad at him and calling him idiot boy. Even Gary hisses at him. SpongeBob becomes extremely upset by this and decides to run away from home. He leaves a note for his friends and a yearly supply of Gary's food in his bowl. The next day, Patrick and Sandy approach his house. Patrick to borrow hot sauce, and Sandy because she feels bad about what happened and wants to apologize. When they arrive though, they realize that SpongeBob isn't in his house, so Sandy kicks down the door where they discover his note, leaving the two to feel incredibly bad about what they had said to him previously. Sandy and Patrick arrive at a flustered Krusty Krab, as no Krabby Patties are being made due to SpongeBob's disappearance. Mr. Krabs is incredibly distraught to find that he was mentioned in SpongeBob's note and instantly wants to search and find him. The only person not fazed by his disappearance is Squidward, who doesn't want him to be found. And it's only when Mr. Krabs offers him the last piece to his fancy egg collection that he agrees to help him with the search. Meanwhile, we learn that SpongeBob hit his head hard during his travels and has no idea who he is. He wanders into New Kelp City, and the only thing he had on his person were his bubbles. He uses his bubble blowing technique throughout town, as it's the only thing he knows how to do, but everyone runs away in fear of him. This is explained whenever the Bubble Poppers arrive, which are seemingly a violent gang in town who pop all bubbles and don't allow any to be blown. SpongeBob easily defeats them by trapping them in bubbles, and because of his accomplishment and bravery, he's promoted as the new mayor of New Kelp City. Sandy, Mr. Krabs, and Squidward end up witnessing SpongeBob's indictment speech as mayor and are confused by the name he's given himself, that being Cheesehead Brown Pants. Alrighty then, not as catchy as the original, but whatever. Sandy approaches the stage to apologize to him, but he has no idea who she is, and even thinks she may be a weasel. He doesn't even remember the matching tattoo that he has with Patrick. He ends up telling Sandy that all he remembers is hitting his head, and then voila, he's mayor. Which is when she realizes that he actually did lose his memory, and he's not just pretending to not know who they are due to his anger. They then kidnap SpongeBob from his mayor duties and force him into the Krusty Krab, convinced that seeing the place will jog his memory, when it doesn't. Squidward begins getting annoyed as he doesn't actually care if SpongeBob stays or leaves. He just wants his fancy egg. And so, Mr. Krabs reluctantly gives it to him since technically he did help find SpongeBob and help with his return. Unfortunately for Squidward, he accidentally drops the egg and it bounces on SpongeBob's head before shattering onto the ground. With his head hit once more, SpongeBob begins remembering everything. At first, he still wants to go back to New Kelp City as he is their mayor, and feels bad abandoning his new position. But once he hears the newfound gang trying to reconstruct law and order within the town after bubbles begin popping up literally everywhere, he decides to just stay with his friends instead. Next up, another family episode, Stanley S. SquarePants. It all begins when Stanley arrives through the mail, much to SpongeBob's delight. SpongeBob asks Stanley why he was sent to SpongeBob by their uncle, revealing that Stanley is his cousin, and Stanley explains that their uncle can't handle him anymore, and thought that SpongeBob might be able to handle him better. SpongeBob doesn't question this at all, and gladly lets Stanley stay with him, but it's soon revealed just why Stanley was sent away. He clogs SpongeBob's toilet, throws his things out of his fridge, rips open Sandy's water suit, and can't even impress Patrick. He also tells SpongeBob that he can't hold a job since he messes everything up, and when SpongeBob begins getting ready for a shift at the Krusty Krab, it's obvious that Stanley is sad. SpongeBob, seeing this, decides to let Stanley accompany him to his job to watch in hopes that it might make him feel better about his lack of one. Once there, Mr. Krabs gets incredibly excited about the fact that there's two SpongeBobs standing right in front of him, and he instantly wants to hire Stanley since he assumes he will be just as good of a worker as SpongeBob. SpongeBob even vouches for Stanley after Mr. Krabs asks if he's a good worker, just to be nice, since he knows Stanley really needs a job. Upon being hired, Stanley ends up setting the cash register on fire, leaving a huge line for SpongeBob to deal with, and even breaks SpongeBob's most prized possession, his spatula. SpongeBob, in a rage, confesses everything to Mr. Krabs, talks about how bad of a worker Stanley is, and tells him everything that he's done wrong since working there. However, instead of getting super upset with Stanley, Mr. Krabs decides to get Stanley a job at the Chum Bucket, so that he can mess everything up over there instead. The episode ends with Stanley literally blowing up the competition. Not a bad strategy from Eugene. Here's a classic. Not normal. This season 6 episode begins with Squidward yelling at SpongeBob claiming that he isn't a normal person. This causes SpongeBob to have an inner reflection on himself and question his own identity. As we all have sometimes, he ends up buying a book called How to Be Normal for Beginners and slowly transforms himself into a normal person. He loses his squareness and becomes more round. His buck teeth turn normal, and his personality becomes dull as well. He turns his pineapple into a normal suburban home and even begins working in a cubicle at the Krusty Krab. Obviously, this doesn't work, and he ends up losing his job. SpongeBob eventually goes to Squidward's house to talk about this newfound life, and he proclaims that Squidward is also quite abnormal given his appearance and lifestyle. This upsets Squidward greatly, and he kicks SpongeBob out of his house, cause yeah, calling someone abnormal in that sense is just kinda rude. SpongeBob then, unhappy with his life, approaches Patrick and hopes to bounce back to his usual self, but nothing works. It's only when Squidward shows up to Patrick in his normal state, presumably upset about what SpongeBob had said to him previously that day, that SpongeBob gets so scared that he transforms back to his past self. Well, that'll do, I guess. The episode Plankton's Regular begins with Plankton having a customer, a never-before event occurring, a singular fish approaching and eating at the chum bucket. It begins when a fish named Nat arrives and orders one chum stick. This shocks Plankton, but not as much as it does the second day, or when Nat said that he will now be a regular chum bucket customer. Plankton heads over to the Krusty Krab to gloat to Mr. Krabs about how he now has a regular customer. And this upsets Mr. Krabs because, well, he's extremely greedy, as we've seen, and doesn't want Plankton to have any success with his business, even if that means just one fish. He sends SpongeBob to try and sway Nat over to their side, but nothing works. What? You mean forcefully shoving a Krabby Patty into someone's mouth didn't work? Who would have thought? Eventually, Mr. Krabs gets fed up with it and decides to try and steal the chum formula in order to get Nat to eat at his restaurant instead. Oh, how the tables are turning. He gets trapped in the chum bucket and is left to the mercy of Plankton when all of a sudden, Nat arrives and throws a wad of cash at Karen, claiming he can't handle another chum stick, as he's already had his stomach pumped twice now, revealing that Karen was actually bribing Nat the whole time. This greatly amuses Mr. Krabs, and the episode ends with Plankton crying in agony as Mr. Krabs laughs from his trap, winning their feud once again. I kinda feel bad for Plankton here. The episode Cephalopod Lodge begins with SpongeBob becoming curious about Squidward's strange mood he gets in once on a Wednesday each month. He's so infatuated by this that he follows Squidward into a strange building later that night, only to find him a part of some weird cult called Cephalopod Lodge, as everyone who's a part of it is a cephalopod. You know, like some type of squid-like creature. SpongeBob and Patrick are quickly found out, and Roger, the presumed leader, gets super upset and kicks Squidward out by association. Squidward is extremely distraught by this, and SpongeBob and Patrick attempt to make it better by making their own little clubs, one of which they force you to sting your tongue with a jellyfish in order to be initiated, which shockingly doesn't make Squidward feel any better. Get it? Since their little clubs aren't helping, they decide to dress up like a scary eel and have Squidward protect the lodge from the Saki menace. This initially works and they let him back in, but SpongeBob and Patrick take off their disguise to congratulate him and are found out yet again. Squidward is kicked out again, and SpongeBob and Patrick resort to their old method and initiate Squidward into their weird club once more, stinging his tongue and causing him to yell in pain. The episode Welcome to the Bikini Bottom Triangle begins with SpongeBob and his friends hearing mermaids singing through the night and awakening to find several of their items missing. Upon trying to figure out what happened, not to mention where Mr. Krabs went, Squidward and SpongeBob are sucked up into some weird-ass magical mermaid vacuum. Once there, they find their items, which surround several mermaid women who apparently summoned it all there via their song. Looking for a way home, the Bikini Bottomites can't figure out how to leave, and are told by the mermaids that that isn't their problem. That is, until Pearl mentions how she just wants to go to the mall.
Go to the mall!
The mermaids are intrigued by Pearl's description of the mall, and also would love to go there. And so, SpongeBob suggests that the mermaids attempt to sing their song backwards, assuming that this will maybe push them back to Bikini Bottom. Surprise, surprise, it works. The episode ends with them finding the Krabby Patty secret formula safe with one of the sailor fishes while he continues to cook Krabby Patties for everyone during their leave. So I guess add this dude to the list of people who know the Krabby Patty formula. You know, it's been a while since the last family episode. Let's look at Big Sister Sam. This later episode begins with Patrick getting excited about how his big sister, Sam, is coming to town, and how they haven't seen each other since they were small. SpongeBob is also excited by this, until she actually shows up and proves to be slightly dumber than Patrick, and, a bit larger. She throws SpongeBob after he's introduced because she thinks he's a danger to Patrick, even though there were no signs that pointed to this conclusion at all. She also gets overprotective again whenever Squidward enters the picture, and quickly the two become enemies, destroying each other's houses. SpongeBob begins getting frustrated with Patrick after he doesn't understand the damage that Sam is causing, and Patrick thinks SpongeBob is a traitor who is seemingly sympathizing with Squidward. It's only when Sam throws a bulldozer at SpongeBob's house that Patrick realizes the damage being caused. Sam then ends up leaving after accidentally harming Patrick, saying she needed a manicure, and the episode ends with Patrick and SpongeBob making up. In the episode The Other Patty, SpongeBob is tired of Mr. Krabs and Plankton always fighting and gives them a talk about how they need to stop acting that way, but they both refuse. Until a new shop starts up in town called the Krabby Patty. Doesn't that sound appetizing? The two compete with each other to try and find out the Flabby secret formula, since it's supposedly better than the Krabby Patties. And Neptune knows they don't need any more competition in town. Eventually, the two decide to somewhat work together, disguising themselves as a worker looking for a new job. Bafflingly, their plan works, and once they're hired, their first task is to memorize the Flabby Patty secret formula. And after all that stress and turmoil, and all their reconciliation, the two become incredibly upset when they find that the main thing on their secret recipe list is friendship. SpongeBob then reveals himself as the new manager, which further frustrates the two. The episode ends with them running off to beat SpongeBob senselessly. At least they're doing it as friends, I guess. The third episode of Season 8, Drive-Thru, begins with Mr. Krabs trying to repair a hole in the wall of the Krusty Krab with some toothpaste, when all of a sudden a customer rolls up and attempts to order since they think it's a drive-thru. This gives Mr. Krabs the brilliant idea to create a drive-thru instead of fixing the hole. How has it taken him this long to do this? Sadly, over time, the drive-thru proves to be unsuccessful after many accidents occur, which causes Mr. Krabs to lose money. The hole is too small and too low for a lot of stuff to fit through, so Mr. Krabs decides to make another hole, even higher than the first one. Towards the end of the episode, the Krusty Krab gets so busy that he decides to make another drive-thru on the other side of the Krusty Krab by slamming a hole into the other side of the building. This causes major stress for Squidward and SpongeBob while they try to feed everyone, because, yeah, 2 employees running 3 drive-thrus in the interior go-ons of a restaurant is just unfair. Mr. Krabs ends up getting frustrated with all their questions on how they could possibly keep up with the amount of people showing up, resulting in him slamming yet another hole in the wall. And with so many different holes in the wall, the entire building collapses in on itself. The episode ends with Mr. Krabs crying in utter defeat as SpongeBob pulls out a nearly empty toothpaste container claiming they can still fix it. Toothpaste. Go figure. The episode A SquarePants Family Vacation isn't necessarily important to the overall plot of the show's core, but SpongeBob's parents take him and Patrick on an absolute joyride. First of all, his parents haven't been seen throughout most of the entire show, but when they do finally show up again, they prove to be absolute adventure junkies. Just look at them go! I mean, granted, SpongeBob and Patrick kinda have a grander adventure there, but still, props to them. The episode Karen 2.0 begins with Plankton shutting Karen down after she runs out of memory, and creating a new Karen, which he calls Karen 2. He puts Karen out into the street, leaving SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs to find her instead. What is up with Plankton's mistreatment of Karen? That's just horrible. They take her to the Krusty Krab and plug her back in, and SpongeBob is convinced that it must be one of Plankton's schemes, but upon awakening, it's clear that it isn't an evil plan, and Karen is quite literally heartbroken. She watches from the Krusty Krab as Plankton has a romantic dinner with his new girlfriend, Karen 2. The next day, Karen is seen working at the Krabby Patty, but things become awkward when Karen 2 and Plankton walk into the establishment. Karen and Karen 2 end up getting into a brawl, resulting in Karen 2 accidentally running Plankton over. This enrages Karen, who still loves Plankton, and she absolutely demolishes Karen 2. Plankton then realizes that Karen is actually the one for him, and gives her Karen 2's heart after she malfunctioned at the end of the fight. The episode ends with the two happily back together at the Chum Bucket, and Squidward being forced to wear the face screen left behind by Karen 2 while he works, since kids love robots apparently. Can we just talk about how absolutely terrifying that entire episode was? Jeez. Time for another classic, it's a SpongeBob Christmas. This stop-motion special begins with Plankton yet again trying to ruin everyone else's good time. Bah, humbug. He's upset that everyone in town gets presents from Santa except for him, so he decides to create Jerktonium to transform everyone into bigger jerks than him so that he will look good by comparison. He carries out his evil plan by infusing a bunch of fruitcake with the Jerktonium and attempting to give people some of his poisoned goods around town. He stumbles upon SpongeBob first though, and the Jerktonium seems to have no effect. Plankton gets frustrated and feeds SpongeBob copious amounts of the stuff, but nothing seems to happen, enraging him to the point that he ends up giving SpongeBob the keys to his cake launcher and giving up on his plan altogether. SpongeBob then goes around town to give out the fruitcakes instead, and unknowingly infuses everyone around town with the jerktonium. Plankton consults Karen about the phenomenon, and she explains that SpongeBob probably isn't affected because of his childlike wonder and innocence that surrounds Christmas. Also, he's just an extremely kind person in general. Plankton decides to unleash his Plan B in order to save his original plan of being the only nice fish in town. That Plan B is revealed to be an evil robotic version of SpongeBob that he calls Toy Bob, who he plans to release into Bikini Bottom to cause havoc and tarnish SpongeBob's reputation. The robot succeeds at first, after upsetting Mr. Krabs and throwing a freaking door at Squidward. SpongeBob eventually makes his way to Sandy's tree dome, where she too has become a jerk. But after SpongeBob accidentally knocks some of the fruitcake into her analyzer machine, it's revealed that it's contaminated with the jerktonium. Sandy then scans SpongeBob since he's worried about all the cake he ate earlier, but there are no traces. Sandy begins analyzing her notes on the antidote to such a substance, but she can't seem to decipher it, until SpongeBob sees it and realizes that it's actually sheet music. He sings a line, and Sandy is instantly cured of her jerkiness. SpongeBob then goes into the middle of town and sings for everyone, and they all get cured. Conveniently, Santa then shows up and announces that while they might be better now, they all already found themselves on the naughty list this year, and he can't help them. He then awards Plankton with the secret formula as he was a saint in comparison to everybody else. SpongeBob tries to explain to Santa what actually happened, but he isn't hearing any of it, as he thinks SpongeBob is the worst of them all, because of his doppelganger. All of a sudden, the Toybot does arrive and attempts to destroy Santa, as he was programmed to kill Christmas. And Santa is quite literally the embodiment of that. SpongeBob rescues him by shooting a bunch of fruitcakes out of the doppelganger, causing his holes to clog and for him to blow up. Santa thanks SpongeBob and finds out who built the Toybot through its tag, which reads, "If lost, return to the chum bucket." He then punishes Plankton by having his elves drop copious amounts of coal onto him. Yeah, that'll do it. The episode ends with everyone having a Merry Christmas, and Patrick trying to capture Santa while he flies away. Anyway, all is well within Bikini Bottom. Chum fricassee begins with Squidward not feeling valued anymore as a worker at the Krusty Krab, and after overhearing Squiddy's lambasting, Plankton begs him to come work for him at the chum bucket instead. After realizing that he isn't valued nearly that much by Mr. Krabs, Squidward accepts. He quickly turns the chum bucket into Le Chum Bucket, and it becomes a massive hit. After not having any customers, Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob decide to attempt to eat there to see what all the hubbub is about. But once there, their disguises are quickly found out, and Squidward sets up a table for the two in the bathroom at one of the toilets. The two leave, and Squidward notices a bunch of fish waiting for food and demands that they get their chum. Plankton reminds Squidward that he said his chum needs to cook for 24 hours before giving it out to customers. But Squidward ignores this and tells Plankton to give them their food anyway. Plankton goes to do so, but Squidward's grandmother catches wind of what he's doing and arrives at the chum bucket and yells at him for potentially harming the customers with his rushed chum, as the chum he was serving was her secret recipe. The fish decide to burn down the chum bucket in retaliation after the fish inside of the building find out about him potentially putting them in harm's way. The episode ends with Mr. Krabs rehiring Squidward as their doormat in order to teach him a lesson. Season 9 contains one of SpongeBob's worst nightmares: unemployment. In SpongeBob You're Fired, he enters the Krusty Krab only to find out that he's actually, for realsies, no joke, no lie at all, being fired. Mr. Krabs is apologetic, but explains that firing him will save him a nickel an hour. Is that how much SpongeBob was making? SpongeBob offers to work for free since he loves the Krusty Krab so much, but Mr. Krabs said he already looked into that and it's illegal for him to have a worker that he isn't paying. Squidward counters this and asks why he can't be fired instead, to which Mr. Krabs says that he didn't fire him because he has seniority over SpongeBob. This leaves an extremely sad SpongeBob to waddle away in defeat, only to be told by Patrick once he arrives home that being unemployed is actually the best, and they should have a grand time together. I highly doubt. He explains his 3 fun employment rules. See what he did there? To SpongeBob, which includes bother Squidward during breakfast, take a midday nap, and then have a free lunch. That looks probably just as good as a soggy family meal from Long John Silver's. Delish. Or would that be cannibalism? Moving on, after hanging out with Sandy, she tells SpongeBob that he should just get a different job, which instantly takes him out of his funk. He proceeds to attempt to work at 3 different locations, but none of them keep him for more than a few minutes because he can't seem to make anything besides patty concoction. SpongeBob goes home sad, but is quickly bombarded by 4 different people dressed up in mascot suits fighting over him, since they all realize that his patties were a huge success and they shouldn't have fired him to begin with. One of the mascots, dressed in a burger costume, ends up snagging SpongeBob once and for all, and and proceeds to take him to the Krusty Krab. It's there that Mr. Krabs apologizes to SpongeBob for firing him, and that he was only keeping the restaurant afloat. Squidward was the one in the mascot, and even he confesses that he would much rather have SpongeBob be there than smell any more of Mr. Krabs' burnt patties. SpongeBob happily gets his job back, and is so excited that he gets Mr. Krabs and Squidward new outfits. For some reason, one of them was a dress. The episode ends with Mr. Krabs explaining that he's getting his quarters back by installing a toilet with a usage fee. He's gone too far. So I bet some of you are tired of hearing the word SquarePants at this point, which I get. Now let's look at an episode, SpongeBob Long Pants. Not to be confused with SpongeBob Round Pants, which is also the basis of an episode. How the hell are new pants the gimmick of two separate episodes in this show? Anyway, this episode in Season 9 begins with SpongeBob buying a pair of long pants after feeling like his knees were chilly, when he subsequently gets a big head after the positive reactions he receives. Everybody that he knows regards him as more mature, and Mr. Krabs likes him so much he gets him out of the kitchen. He begins greeting customers at the door, but decides he doesn't like it because the messy eaters are dirtying his pants. He then quits the Krusty Krab, an event that is quite literally unheard of. You know what else is unheard of? He goes on to get his driver's license for the first time ever, because they trust him with his long pants. Later that day, he decides to get a different job at a super fancy restaurant in town that's called, you won't believe this, Fancy. Once there, a fancy customer views SpongeBob in such high regard because of his pants that he invites him to a fancy party, to which SpongeBob accepts. SpongeBob finally starts to wear on his new persona, when the fancy fish don't want to go watch the new Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy movie and instead would rather just watch a movie called Table. Sounds amazing. SpongeBob leaves their area and bumps into Sandy and several of his other friends. She asks him if he's going to the premiere but is interrupted by the fancy fish, who asks SpongeBob to go drink coffee with him and watch the news. This sounds extremely boring to him, and he declines, telling them that he's going to watch the premiere instead, that he's also going to be working at the Krusty Krab from now on. They get upset, since he's a fraud, and disown him from their fancy friend group. To make matters worse, SpongeBob then isn't able to get into the premiere because apparently only short pants people are allowed in. SpongeBob cries until Mr. Krabs cuts off his legs in order for him to not be wearing long pants since he couldn't get them off. His legs grow back instantly, but that's still crazy, and he happily watches the movie. The episode ends with the boating instructor approaching SpongeBob and ripping up his license since he no longer is a long pants wearer. Man, if that's all I need to get a good reputation, I'm gonna go buy a pair of jeans right now. I'm going to Macy's, I'm gonna be back in an hour. The episode Fishbowl begins with Sandy wanting to observe different fish's behavior for her psychological experiments, but she quickly realizes that random fish don't like to be observed. And upon asking SpongeBob and Patrick if she can observe them, she finds out that if people within the experiment are aware of the study, then they may have inaccurate results. To combat this issue, she then decides to study them naturally by setting up secret cameras. She instructs SpongeBob and Patrick to retrieve buckets of sand for her, and she promotes Patrick to be in charge, and then watches from afar in her lab to see what happens. Patrick, being Patrick, ends up getting too carried away, since he was in charge, making SpongeBob count all the sand and taking all the ice cream offered to them. Sandy finally splits up their fight after it becomes physical, and Patrick apologizes to SpongeBob for being so rude. SpongeBob forgives him and blames the experiment and science in general. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Time to look at feral friends. That's not a sentence you'll want to hear every day, but you're safe in this context, I swear. This interesting episode of Season 10 begins with Sandy's birthday. Everything quickly goes haywire, however, when every single one of her good friends gets turned into real biological depictions of their respected fish breed, occurring after they were exposed to a strange giant green rock orb. Sandy questions this and decides to consult the French narrator of the show. You know, the 2 hours later guy, breaking the fourth wall and also doing something that's never been done throughout the series in the process. He explains to her that the green thing is actually called Neptune's moon, and the effects will last for 2 hours. Before learning this, Sandy found Squidward and shoved him into the shadows in order to not transform. Squidward, who is unaware of this, gets frightened by the sight of fish eating each other and runs home. But because of his escape, he ends up transforming into a giant squid. This obviously horrifies Sandy, but she has to put that to the side for the moment to capture all of her friends, so that Squidward doesn't eat them. This episode is absolutely insane. The narrator then tells Sandy about all the different sea creature species and what they do. Sandy, who's now educated, separates the animals that could harm each other and continues to hide in her tree dome. This works for only a short amount of time though, as Squidward starts climbing on top of her tree dome and breaks into it with his beak. The narrator tells Sandy about Squidward's natural-born enemy, which is apparently enemy, a whale. I, too, didn't know that whales and squids were enemies, so this was a biology lesson for me as well. Wow, I didn't even have to pay for this one. She gets Squidward and Pearl near each other, which causes the two to fight when all of a sudden the 2 hours are up, leaving everybody to turn back to normal, naked. Everybody runs home except for SpongeBob and Patrick, who question Sandy about the day. Before she can fully explain, though, the narrator tells Sandy of the red sun that comes out after the green moon. The red sun is then seen approaching them, and it transforms Sandy into her natural mammal state of a squirrel. What happened? Season 11 starts off strong with Cave-Dwelling Sponge, where SpongeBob accidentally releases a prehistoric sponge without even realizing it. The sponge, named Spongy Sponge, follows SpongeBob all the way home and even follows him to work without him realizing it. At his work, I'm gonna call him SS. SS breaks several different customers' things, and SpongeBob gets blamed for it since he's supposedly the only sponge in town. Once in jail, SpongeBob tries to convince Mr. Krabs that it wasn't him who stole all the belongings, but he doesn't quite believe him until SS breaks through the prison wall and exposes himself. SpongeBob tries to communicate with SS, but it doesn't work out the best.
Spongy.
They're seen breakdancing? SS also ends up breaking down the entire court office, but of course he didn't get in trouble because apparently he saved the city money as they were planning on demolishing the building the following week anyway. The episode ends with SS breaking the camera, which breaks the fourth wall, only after the news reporter also broke the fourth wall by saying Bikini Bottom has returned to normal. If only for this episode. The writers are getting a bit friskier, huh? Grandmom's the word. One of my favorite episodes so far starts with Plankton giving Karen a mud bath. Finally. This is the first time in the entire series that I've seen that man be a decent partner. Anyway, he's interrupted by a call from his grandma, who reminds him that tomorrow is her 90th birthday. And apparently, Plankton had promised her that by her 90th birthday, he would own the Krusty Krab. He approaches Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob about his predicament, and since he's actually being sincere, the two agree to let him pretend to own it for a singular day. Once Plankton's grandma shows up, she introduces herself as Lily, and she becomes incredibly infatuated by Squidward. Towards the end of the episode, she asks Plankton if the two of them could take a photo together in front of the Krabby Patty secret formula. Plankton eventually convinces SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs to allow this, but before the flash can go off, she takes the formula and flies away with her secret machine that allows her to float throughout the air. SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs at first get mad at Plankton because they think he's behind it, but he confesses that he had no idea about the plan at all. Lily also tells him that she will not be sharing it, and that she will rule Bikini Bottom without him. Before she can do anything with the formula though, she thankfully falls asleep, since she's literally 90 years old. Mr. Krabs retrieves the formula, and the episode ends with Plankton feeding her prune juice and wishing her a happy birthday. I guess villainy runs in the family. The episode High Sea Diving begins with SpongeBob claiming that he will be the first sponge to ever reach the surface of the ocean. Keep telling yourself that, buddy. I see sponges in showers all the time. After being confused as to how to dive upwards, he ends up using balloons in order to do so. SpongeBob eventually slams into a large trash island, where he finds Old Man Jenkins, who's an old local fish. While up there, SpongeBob accidentally sends down a bunch of trash, and the citizens below think that Neptune is blessing them with gifts from above. Eventually, SpongeBob decides to create a ladder for him and Old Man Jenkins to climb down back to Bikini Bottom. But once the fish see the ladder hit the bottom, they all assume that it's a ladder up to Neptune, and almost a heaven-like place. SpongeBob and Old Man Jenkins end up making it about halfway down before they run into almost all the citizens of the Bikini Bottom. Eventually, the ladder breaks under all the shaking and pressure, and Old Man Jenkins decides to pretend to be Neptune in order for everybody to love him. And then the real Neptune arrives and smites him because of this. After the incident, trash lines the street of Bikini Bottom, and SpongeBob is seen as some sort of hero for what he's gifted them all. This one went all over the place. Next up is The Night Patty. This strange episode begins with a hungry SpongeBob and Patrick out late. Who would have guessed that from the title? SpongeBob tells Patrick that he wishes he could go to the Krusty Krab, to which Patrick reveals that the Krusty Krab is indeed open at night and has a night crew. This shocks SpongeBob, and upon arriving at the Krusty Krab, they see a lot of strange deep-sea night creatures. SpongeBob enjoys his order so much that he decides to go into the back to personally thank the chef, but upon thanking him, he ends up shaking his hand too hard, resulting in him not being able to cook anymore that night. SpongeBob is then left to take over and figure out the night menu, trying to come up with something the night fish will enjoy since they don't like his Krabby Patties. He accidentally burns one, which for some reason they love, and he calls it the Night Patty. The episode ends with Mr. Krabs arriving at the Krusty Krab that morning and wondering why SpongeBob was there so early, to which he tells him that he was working for the night crew. This bewilders Mr. Krabs, as he knows for a fact that there is no night crew at the Krusty Krab. The narrator then explains that SpongeBob was actually inside of the tidal zone, and that his shift didn't actually happen on our plane of existence. This is a super cool reference to the Twilight Zone, and fun fact, isn't the only episode to do this. There's other episodes such as A Skin Wrinkle in Time, The Switch Glitch, and No Pictures Please, that all make callbacks to the classic 60s series. Pretty cool. Next, we're looking at Girls' Night Out. This episode isn't too important, but I thought it was fun that Sandy called up Karen and Mrs. Puff to have a girls' night out. It consisted of them pranking the boys that annoyed them in their lives. Mrs. Puff pranking SpongeBob and Karen pranking Plankton. I just thought it was cute to see the girlies of the show hanging out and having fun. Here we have Sandy's nutty nieces, and big surprise, we meet Sandy's nieces in this episode. It begins with SpongeBob offering to babysit them, to which Sandy disagrees and warns him about how rowdy they can be. SpongeBob insists, but it is shown just how rowdy the kids can be as they absolutely destroy him. He begins their day by taking them to his work, but once they are kicked out, he tries taking them to Goo Lagoon, but they beat him senseless there as well. Once back at SpongeBob's house, they end up wrestling with Patrick and losing, and they run back to Sandy upset. At her tree dome, Sandy reveals that she was setting up a bouncy house for them, and once they're through with their bouncing, she quickly sends them back to their own mother. The episode ends with Sandy's wise words. I think we should all remember before having children. One rule about babysitting her nieces is to just not. Another child-centric episode is up next, this time being Karen's baby. How is this gonna work? This episode begins with Karen awaiting the package of her new son that she ordered. Plankton isn't happy about this and doesn't want the child to arrive, with the tiny green guy going out of his way to prevent the child from arriving successfully. But the baby is delivered anyway. Once there, Karen names him Chip, and he begins to go through different stages in life. Whenever he reaches teenager levels, he starts to talk back to Karen, to which he asks Plankton to have a chat with him. This doesn't work out the best, however, as Plankton just tells him to run away. Chip does, and when Karen finds out, let's just say she's less than pleased. She orders Plankton to go find him, or she would greatly harm him and he wouldn't be allowed to re-enter the chum bucket ever again. Plankton goes out into Bikini Bottom, and shockingly finds that Chip has been bombarded by gang violence. Plankton rescues him and brings him home to a happy and relieved Karen. Chip then goes off to college and becomes a successful ATM, and he ends up pranking Mr. Krabs by not letting him have any money, to which Plankton lovingly looks on and says, "That's my boy." Dang, now I want to be an ATM. Now we're gonna take a look at Shell Games. This episode begins with Patrick's big rock waking up and revealing to the audience that it's actually a turtle and his shell. The turtle wants to go to Goo Lagoon to woo the ladies for mating season, but Patrick won't leave him alone. The ladies at the lagoon are also more interested in Patrick, which greatly upsets the turtle as he wants to woo them instead. He starts fighting with Patrick because he won't leave, and eventually, his shell ends up getting crushed. The episode ends with Patrick telling the turtle that he can just use Squidward's house as a shell instead, resulting in Squidward returning home seeing his house being taken away by a turtle surrounded by ladies. I always knew Squidward's house would attract the most ladies. To end off our episode recaps, let's take a look at SpongeBob's Big Birthday Blowout. This interesting special two-part episode begins with all SpongeBob's friends wanting to throw a surprise birthday party for him. Before they begin setup, Patrick is tasked with taking SpongeBob on a surface-level tour, meaning the real world. During their tour, they are shown around a lot of different places, one being a burger joint that is strikingly familiar to the Krusty Krab. It even had a Plankton-type character come in to try and steal the patty formula. After that part of the tour, SpongeBob questions the leader about the aquarium next door, to which he explains that it's quite dangerous and they must not go near it. Naturally, they're then picked up by a human and placed into the aquarium, as the human thought they were a lost part of the exhibit. Meanwhile, in SpongeBob's house, his friends and mutual friends can't seem to get along and end up trashing a large portion of the place. Thankfully, Sandy gets annoyed with this and orders them all to calm down and work on their respective parts, getting everyone under control. SpongeBob and the gang in the bus end up making it out of the aquarium and back to SpongeBob's house only to find it in ruins. SpongeBob opens the door to a bunch of his friends sleeping, to which they happily tell him happy birthday, and of course the little yellow sponge is overjoyed by this and incredibly grateful, even though there is chaos all over his personal space. The episode ends with a bunch of celebrities telling him happy birthday, and a special message to the late creator of the series at the end that reads, "Thank you, Steven Hillenburg." I feel like that's as sweet a place as any to conclude out episode recaps, but we aren't done yet. That's right, folks, we got some movies to look at. Here we go. In the SpongeBob SquarePants movie, the first one, after a brief pirate-filled intro, the action commences right as SpongeBob wakes up. He heads to the Krusty Krab as there is a new shop opening that day called the Krusty Krab 2. Ironically, it looks just like the Krusty Krab and is also located directly next to it. SpongeBob is convinced that he will be the new manager of the establishment since he's the hardest worker at the original. But during Mr. Krabs' speech, he finds that Squidward is actually awarded the position due to the fact that SpongeBob is still too young. Upset about this, he finds himself at the ice cream parlor Goofy Goober's Ice Cream Party Boat that he and Patrick had planned on going to in order to celebrate. SpongeBob assumes they won't be staying after telling Patrick of the bad news, but instead, Patrick orders copious amounts of sundaes, which the two excitedly eat all night, allegedly getting them drunk. Meanwhile, during all of this, Plankton has discovered that he hasn't attempted Plan Z of his wide array of formula-stealing plan, since he thought the alphabet ended at Y. After reading his plan, he travels to King Neptune's castle and steals his crown, before running away to Shell City. Neptune arrives at the Krusty Krab since Plankton planted a note in his castle claiming that Mr. Krabs was the one who stole his crown. He threatens to kill Mr. Krabs on the spot for taking his beloved crown, but SpongeBob steps in and announces that he will return his crown for him in order for Mr. Krabs to be spared. Neptune proclaims that SpongeBob is too young and would literally never be able to return the crown since he has headed off to the forbidden Shell City, which is allegedly a place of no return. SpongeBob insists, and it's only through the help of Neptune's daughter, Mindy, that he convinces Neptune to let him go. Also, Mindy is played by Scarlett Johansson, aka Black Widow. You're welcome for that info. Neptune tells SpongeBob that he must return in 6 days in order to spare Mr. Krabs, before proceeding to freeze him in place as to guarantee that he will still be there when SpongeBob returns. SpongeBob and Patrick quickly begin their travels, but not before getting their trustworthy Patty wagon. Unfortunately for them, once they cross the county line outside of Bikini Bottom, their little wagon gets stolen immediately. At least they lasted 12 seconds. They eventually are able to get it back once they find it parked outside of a threatening-looking bar called the Thug Tug. The thugs inside get distracted upon looking for the bubble-blowing babies, which are SpongeBob and Patrick. But two different thugs accidentally expose themselves, and during their brawl, SpongeBob and Patrick are able to steal the keys and run away. Meanwhile, it's shown that Plankton has hired a hitman named Dennis to make sure SpongeBob and Patrick never return. Plankton was able to steal the Krabby Patty secret formula, since Mr. Krabs is frozen, and SpongeBob wasn't there to get in his way either, and since then has been able to sell the delicious patties from the Chum Bucket, complete with a free bucket helmet with every purchase. Things are looking good for Plankton, as long as SpongeBob never comes back. But Squidward eventually shows up to the Chum Bucket and figures out that Plankton was actually the one who stole the crown.
You're selling Krabby Patties, eh, Plankton?
He attempts to tell Neptune about his discovery, but Plankton reveals that the free Chum Bucket hats he's given out are actually mind-controlling devices. All the brainless fish begin approaching Squidward, and he ends up getting overrun by them. Back in the great unknown, SpongeBob and Patrick stumble upon an ice cream stand in the middle of a huge pile of bones. It's quickly revealed that the owner of the stand is actually a piece of a huge deadly fish that chases the two to an abyss. It ends up falling into it and getting eaten by an even larger, huge serpent type of creature. This is their reaction. SpongeBob and Patrick begin feeling like they really are too young to be on their adventure, and they'll probably be forced to give up, when all of a sudden, Mindy appears and shows the two what has happened to everybody in Bikini Bottom since Plankton is basically controlling everybody. This gives SpongeBob and Patrick some much-needed courage to continue their adventure. She also gives the two mustaches made of seaweed, turning them into men. They then cross the trench with no fear and sing the iconic "Now That We're Men" song. On the other side of the trench, they are faced with Plankton's hitman who almost kills them, until he's squished under the massive boot of a scuba diver. The diver scoops up SpongeBob and Patrick and takes them to the surface, where they're then put in a heat lamp to be dried out for his shop. Before they die, they shed a tear, which causes a short circuit and smoke, which in turn makes the fire alarms go off, giving them water that rain from the ceiling. The two are extremely grateful, and find themselves in the same shop that the crown is located in. They quickly grab it and are whisked away back to Bikini Bottom by David Hasselhoff. During their travels, the hitman comes back, but is defeated yet again due to unforeseen circumstances. David Hasselhoff launches the two deep into the waters using his pec muscles? Okay. They land in the Krusty Krab right before Neptune would have killed Mr. Krabs. Frustrated with their victory, Plankton drops a helmet onto Neptune to seal his victory, and it seems like all hope is lost. Thankfully, SpongeBob counters this by singing a rock version of their iconic Goofy Goober song. This zaps all their helmets off and saves the day, all through the power of being a kid. The movie ends with Plankton being locked up and put into custody, and SpongeBob finally being awarded manager. Keep your childhood close to your heart, folks. Next up, we're looking at the SpongeBob movie Sponge Out of Water. I'd like to preface this movie by saying that it's told in the form of a storybook by a pirate above the ocean waters. Most of the things that go on are determined by the teller of the story, and well, you'll see what I mean as I go on. The pirate begins with Plankton fighting over the Krabby Patty formula yet again, after his plans fail him again. Him and SpongeBob are squabbling about it, when suddenly the Krabby Patty secret formula disappears into thin air. Mr. Krabs automatically thinks Plankton is the one who stole it, and for good reason, but SpongeBob swears with him that it just disappeared. An angry mob accumulates outside of the Krusty Krab, demanding their patties. SpongeBob is ordered to make more, but when he opens up the freezer to get more out, they're all gone. Mr. Krabs wants him to make more and feels that surly SpongeBob has the secret formula memorized by now. But SpongeBob confesses that he doesn't remember it, as knowing the formula by memory is forbidden. The crowd grows larger, and all fingers point to Plankton. And so, SpongeBob ends up blowing a bubble around him and Plankton in order to escape the giant mob, as he knows it's not his fault. Shortly after they whisk away in their bubble, Bikini Bottom almost resembles a post-apocalyptic city, as the Krabby Patties are seemingly the glue that holds the entire town together. And without it, well, let's just continue and see what happens. At this point, the pirate ends the book, as that's the last page. But the seagulls that are listening to the story are not happy with the way that he left things, so they tear out the last page and throw it into the ocean. They demand that they give them a better conclusion, so he continues. Back in the ocean, Patrick is seen finding out about the Krabby Patties being gone and missing, and he starts absolutely wigging out. He runs to Sandy's tree dome and starts yelling at her to let him have her last Krabby Patty, but she eats it herself anyways and turns on her TV to watch the news. Once there, she hears about the missing formula and instantly regrets not savoring her last meal. She then stumbles upon the missing page from the torn-out book that the seagulls had and attempts to interpret the words. Meanwhile, SpongeBob and Plankton decide to work together in order to find the formula and decide to try and rally some of their friends in order to help them. They first approach Patrick, but he's already gone crazy and sends a mob after them. They then approach Sandy, but she's too busy thinking that the sandwich gods are upset with them, since she can't decipher the paper that fell from their sky. They then try to grab Gary, but he's now the leader of the Wild Snail Rebellion. Upset, the two leave and try to figure stuff out on their own. Before they came to this conclusion though, Plankton attempted going inside of SpongeBob's brain to find the formula, as he didn't believe that he wouldn't know it. Once outside of his brain, SpongeBob asked why he would do such a thing, to which he responded that he doesn't trust other people, and that he's sorry. SpongeBob forgives him and urges him to stay on task. They eventually decide to make a time machine in order to go back to before the formula was stolen in the first place. Plankton explains that a computer is a vital part of the time machine, and that they should retrieve Karen and use her. They find her chained up and locked away, since she's the main accomplice of Plankton and a prime suspect of the stolen recipe. Once retrieved, they take Karen to an abandoned restaurant and make a super janky version of a time machine that I'm honestly surprised even works. Before they're able to go back in time, they accidentally go into deep space, where they witness two planets smash into each other after they were told to watch over the cosmic space of the universe, while an all-powerful dolphin named Bubbles used the restroom. Yeah, don't question it. Bubbles then shoots lasers at the boys as they dash back to their respected time. Once face-to-face with their past selves, they convince them that they've teamed up, and their past selves hand over the recipe. Meanwhile, the pirate who told their unfortunate story settles their boat on land, and it's shown that it works as a dual food truck. Or should I say food ship. SpongeBob and Plankton go to return the formula, but when Mr. Krabs goes to open it, it's a fake. SpongeBob has a slight mental breakdown since he can't handle Plankton's constant shenanigans and mistrust, but before it can go too far, SpongeBob smells Krabby Patties coming from the surface. The group follows SpongeBob's nose, but once they get to the surface, they get a little skittish since they can't breathe air. All of a sudden, Bubbles shows up and offers to blow them out of his hole. Don't take that out of context. Apparently, he was grateful when SpongeBob and Plankton caused him to get fired since he actually hated his job. Once on land, they quickly find the pirate's burger joint where he explains to them that he was able to obtain the formula by using his magical book, which he controls reality through by writing its events down in the form of a story. He then strands them all on Pelican Island. It's there that SpongeBob gets the brilliant idea to use the page that had drifted to Bikini Bottom and write their own part of the story. He gives them all superpowers, and they easily defeat the pirate. Plankton was actually the one to get the formula back, and he quickly hands it over to Mr. Krabs, much to everyone's surprise. The movie ends with everyone happily eating Krabby Patties, successfully ending the apocalypse. This movie was absolutely insane. And finally, we now have the most recent of the SpongeBob movies to release, Sponge on the Run. This movie begins like most typical SpongeBob episodes. Plankton is planning something, and SpongeBob is just going about his day at his job. Karen tells Plankton that he should probably factor SpongeBob in on his plans since he usually ignores him, and he's usually the person that actually thwarts him. He ignores her, as per usual, and decides to do his own plan anyway. It's only until after his plans fail yet again that he decides that he probably should listen to her and think about SpongeBob from now on. Meanwhile, Sandy brought a robot to the Krusty Krab that Mr. Krab at first fell in love with. That is, until it tried to fire him on the spot. It angers Mr. Krab so much that he ends up throwing it into Plankton's trash can. It's there that Karen and Plankton first lay eyes on Otto, as he will soon be called. Karen plucks him out of the trash and decides to keep it for herself. The show then cuts to the city of Atlantis, where Poseidon finds that snail slime works wonderfully for his wrinkles. Unfortunately for him, he ran out of snails at Atlantis and sends out a royal decree that he'd like any and all snails to be sent to him. Plankton sees this and uses it as an excuse to steal Gary and have SpongeBob go on a dangerous quest in order to get him back. SpongeBob then returns home to a missing pineapple, and he assumes that Gary must have been stolen given Poseidon's orders. Plankton preps a ride for them, the driver being Otto, and the two are off to Atlantis. Once there, they get distracted by all the fun attractions, such as gambling and eating good food, but they eventually attempt to take Gary home. However, Poseidon doesn't allow this though, and puts the two under arrest. Back in Bikini Bottom, Plankton prompts Mr. Krabs to give him the formula, as he's lost his fry cook and all his business, to which Mr. Krabs then sadly hands it over with no further questioning. This makes Plankton sad, much to his surprise, and after hearing about SpongeBob and Patrick being imprisoned in Atlantis, he decides to help Mr. Krabs, Sandy, and Squidward on their journey to rescue them. Once they reach him, they all confess how much SpongeBob has impacted their lives, and what he truly means to them. Mr. Krabs even reveals that SpongeBob is in fact the secret ingredient in the Krabby Patty formula. Eventually, Poseidon catches wind of them trying to free SpongeBob, Patrick, and Gary and sends guards after them. After a brief fight scene, the guards offer them freedom if only they keep Gary. SpongeBob refuses, which greatly offends Poseidon. But what really gets him going is when SpongeBob calls him out about the fact that he doesn't have any good friends. SpongeBob then gives him a talk about how he doesn't have to look any type of way in order to be loved by others, and that all of them will gladly be his close friend if only he doesn't kidnap Gary. Poseidon takes notes and lets go of his appearance in front of all of his subjects. They all cheer him on, and he decides to release all the snails. The movie ends with SpongeBob being his typical Good Samaritan, turning Bikini Bottom into a sort of snail rescue town. Well, there you go. And that's it, folks. I hope you enjoyed the SpongeBob recap, and let us know if you have any other cartoon suggestions. I will say, there were enough Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episodes for me to make a separate mini episode covering all their lore and involvement, if that's something you guys are interested in. There's also the spin-offs, of course, if that's something that you guys are interested in too. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more updates and fun recaps. And for those of you who follow the channel closely and recognize my voice, it is good to be back. See you next time.